All right, everybody. Can we all take our seats again? I know it's really difficult to interrupt the lively discussions. So good afternoon. I'm Maria Brindelmeyer. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist for YouthPower Learning at Making Sense International. I hope you've had a great lunch and interesting discussions at your table. And I hope you took the opportunity to have a discussion with some of the young change makers. And if you haven't, perhaps you can meet them sometime in the afternoon during a break. This morning provided some really interesting discussions about working towards self-reliance and stormed through some innovative approaches and new ways of looking at youth programming. So please now fasten your seatbelt for this afternoon's agenda, because we're starting with some more lightning talks. And you can find the short descriptions again in your program. And you know when you sometimes go to the mall and you buy 5 things and you get 1 extra? We have the same thing here. We actually have a 7th lightning talk by Waste for Change as a surprise for you. So let's start with our first lightning talk speaker.
Just how important is media in a young person's life? Young people are bombarded with portrayals of the lives they should be leading, the stuff they should have, the horrors of what's wrong with the world and what's wrong with them. And this all at a time when they're figuring out what's important in life, who they are and who they want to be. It's often said that TV and social media have a negative impact on young people. But can these be harnessed to help and inspire young people to make better career choices? Well, I represent an organization that uses media for development, so it's no surprise that we believe that media can be a force for good when used adequately and designed well. And so I'm Yvonne McPherson. I work for BBC Media Action, and we've reached millions of young people by creating innovative programs for and by young people that achieve measurable change. And let me give you an example. In Cambodia, where half the population is below the age of 24, young people have a hard time finding employment. And our research found that one of the reasons for this is that their parents and other elders who grew up under the Khmer Rouge had a very different experience from the youth of today. And so they are not able to adequately guide their children and young people on making good career choices. And so young people are really struggling to figure out what kind of job market there is and where they fit into it, and the kind of confidence that they need in order to make these smart career choices. What we did was we researched the behavioral determinants of that have a negative impact on young people's career choices. Determinants such as knowledge, attitudes, self-efficacy, social norms. And then we created a communication strategy that would address these individual and societal barriers. And what we came up with was a TV and social media project that focused on imparting transferable soft skills to young people. Skills like adaptability, negotiation, time management, communication. And we also included content in an entertaining and exciting way on how to search for a job and CV writing skills, believe it or not, financial planning and economic migration. I'm going to show you a clip now from the TV program. It's called Dream Station, and it's a reality TV show in Cambodia.
This is completely new style of the show in Cambodia. I think it was fair for us to try something new like this. We want it to be as real as possible for people to look at it and feel like, oh, that is actually my story too, you know.
We designed the dream station to be a private space where people can open up about how they were feeling. And I think this is very difficult to do it in Cambodia.
នេះជាលើកទី1ដែលខ្ញុំបានលើកស្អីក្តីជាមួយរបស់ខ្លួនឯងខ្ញុំព្យាយាមធ្វើអីជាមួយនឹងខាងកាហ្វេយើងអត់ជោគជ័យអ្នកដទៃគេអាចយើងទទួលស្គាល់យើងបានដែរបងមួយបានយើងខ្ពស់បានគិតបានសម័យហើយយើងកើតមកយើងមកដូចគេក្រពេករកអីមិនបានថាទៅគឺពិបាកគឺមិនដូចអាចកម្លាំងចិត្តរបស់ខ្ញុំអន់ថយអត់មានភាពនឹងតស៊ូមានបញ្ហាយើងអត់ចេះដោះស្រាយបញ្ហាយើងពិតជាសប្បាយចិត្តមែនតើនៅពេលដែលឃើញយុវជនជាច្រើនគាត់បើកចំហចិត្តគាត់ជាអារម្មណ៍ពិតរបស់គាត់ហ្នឹងតាក់ទងក្តីសម័យរបស់គាត់នៅក្នុងកម្មវិធីរបស់យើង
Each episode features experts, role models, and challenges to help guide the show's audience on their journey. So importantly, in this and in all of our youth projects, we provide spaces for young voices to be heard. Our production teams are made up of young people, and then the social media component like this you see here, a Facebook page for one of our programs, allows the audiences to participate and share their experiences in ways like never before. And in everything we do, we're committed to measuring the impact of what we've achieved. And in this particular case, young people tell us that the content showed them new things, and this was particularly relevant for rural audiences. And then for those who had already had some work experience, that it was a good reminder to set plans and to handle situations better. Our work can't create new jobs or solve some of the structural problems of youth employment, but it can help young people manage these realities and set realistic goals. And one thing that mass media can do that many other interventions cannot is the opportunity to challenge old and shape new norms at great scale. And when I say great scale, with this project we're reaching about half of the population of Cambodians today. So that's, that's scale for you right there. So this is just one such example. We're reaching young people in many countries. And so I would like to leave you with the question, will your next youth initiative involve the power of media? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Chen, and I am a program officer at World Learning. We're an education nonprofit that works on exchange and development programs. And today I'll be talking about the role of digital or virtual exchanges in promoting peace building and violence prevention. In recent years, media portrayals of the Middle East have created a sense of fear between the people in the MENA region and the United States. And in fact, the number of hate crimes that are driven by anti-Muslim or anti-Arab sentiments have reached an all-time high since the Iraq War began 15 years ago. In the past years, we had in-person exchange programs that do promote cross-cultural understanding. However, the need to kind of physically travel from one country to another have prohibited many groups from participating, including refugees, IDPs, people with physical disabilities, and oftentimes women. And so the need to do that has become one of the challenges. However, there is a solution to all of this, and that is to do exchange programming online and do virtual exchange programs. At World Learning, we have a program called the Digital Young Leaders Exchange Program, and it is an online exchange program for high school youth from Iraq and the United States. And the goal is to promote peace building and develop mutual understanding. And so for 3 months during the summer, the students get online together and they do a few activities. They share photos of their favorite meals. So we have a Greek salad here and a picture of dolma from a student in Iraq. Students get together and also talk about how they have different perspectives and why that is beneficial. They also get together through video conferencing, and through these small group deeper discussions, they have dialogue about stereotype and biases, and oftentimes that results in a selfie at the end of the call. They also develop projects for their local communities, and they recognize a lot of similarities that are shared for issues that are inherent in their communities across different boundaries. And that is not my slide. And so, not sure where the rest of the slides went, but they also get together and talk to a digital activist through a live webinar. And I think the results that we've seen from this have been pretty astonishing. Since 2016, we reached over 300 youth in Iraq and the United States. We've seen mutual understanding strengthened. The number of participants who report learning something positive about another country range from 80 to 100%. We've also seen increases of civic engagement. Alumni of my program in Sacramento have fundraised $2,000 to provide more halal food options for refugees in her community. A group of my students in Iraq have advocated with their school administration to reopen their school library. And alumni in The Hook in Iraq have got together to create dialogue groups for people from different parts of the country. And so through dial-up, I think they're really able to build relationships across tense national boundaries, especially with difficulties to physically travel from one country to another. The potential to do so online has been greater than ever. But what this program can do for U.S. and Iraq is really just the beginning. And so I had a map of these lines kind of coming all over the place. And so what if this is just more than U.S. and Iraq? What if we can do this connecting countries who have built up perceptions of each other and really expand this program to reach people from very remote regions, connecting youth from any country, anywhere, across regional and cross socioeconomic contexts. So that is a question that I will leave you all with.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Kaplan, and I'm the Chief of Party of USAID Bridges to Employment, which we call Puentes para el Empleo, in El Salvador. I'm here to share 5 minutes of materials and tools that we have developed, and I would like to give a little bit of history of these materials and tools so that you know why we've developed them, and then perhaps they'll be useful to you. In El Salvador, we've been given what I'm calling a double migration challenge. How do we, in a workforce development and youth project, how do we address the youth that are leaving or want to leave El Salvador, usually to come to the United States, and then how do we address those who are now and soon to be returning from mostly the United States to El Salvador, given a lot of the changes in the U.S. administration. So it's our double migration challenge. These youth are very different from each other, and I think in the beginning we had one type of program which was just addressing the youth that are living in El Salvador, and then suddenly we're looking at youth that are coming back. So we have a new cohort of returned migrants, and we have to figure out how we are going to change, how we're going to provide these new youth with options in El Salvador. We are providing employability with training and life skills. I call them life instead of soft. Life skills. It's soft sounds really funny in Spanish. And job readiness training, training in entrepreneurship, giving them on-the-job experience. Some of them need to return to formal schooling. But the situation totally changed when we were thinking about what are we going to do with the returned migrants. They already speak English. They probably already have high school education or more. Will they accept a job that pays
$300 a month at an entry level. So our project needed to change quite drastically, but at the same time address the other migration challenge, so we didn't want to make major changes in the project. Improving quality of support services that are available to the vulnerable youth. This is where the sustainability and self-reliance comes in. This is where we're providing the technical assistance and training to the training centers themselves, institutional strengthening, develop curricula, train the training centers to work with the private sector, and then improving the private sector perception of youth through media campaigns. The youth that are in El Salvador and the ones that are coming back have their negative perceptions of them, of their age, of where they live, obviously that they're all considered gang members by where they live. And so we are working on media campaigns and working with NGOs and CSOs and providing training to them to help change their perceptions of the vulnerable youth that we work with. And how are we doing it? Well, through, again, the immigration deterrence and then addressing the return youth. And one of the things that we have developed, and it's still being approved, so soon you'll find it on the deck and soon you'll be able to download it in Spanish first and then in English, a psychosocial assistance toolkit. So this toolkit is how do we work, how we work, and how youth can work with other youth and how institutions can work with youth on all of these different chapters. 1 minute left. So the next immigration deterrent is not only using what exists in El Salvador with life skills, but creating 2 new chapters based on PYD. There were some chapters that were missing, so we created 2 new ones and working on those additional models. And one thing that I don't think made the slides, but 30 orientation guides for the jobs that exist in El Salvador and how young people coming back or young people so they don't leave can work themselves and with their counselors, and one day guidance counselors we hope will exist in some of the training centers that we're working in so that they can help the youth with these orientation guides, help them learn what they need to get in terms of training and skills, and my time ends there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Wheeler from the Kaizen Company. And for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to be sharing with you guys the Learning Links model. And Learning Links is a gig economy business model that we've lifted pretty unapologetically from companies like Uber and Lyft, and we're applying it to education for out-of-school kids. So the backdrop for this is Liberia, and literacy rates in Liberia are very low, school attendance is very low, and things are particularly bad for girls who get pregnant while they're in school because they're forced to drop out of school and they fall behind in their studies and really have very few avenues to return to education. But against this bleak backdrop, there's actually a pretty exciting silver lining, is that is even though literacy is low, still in rural communities in Liberia, about 20% of women are literate and numerate, and that's an exciting opportunity. So here's what this opportunity looks like on a personal level. We have Mary, I think your left, is 17. Her son is Edwin, was born about a year ago. She's been out of school for 2 years. She's illiterate, and she has very few options for building literacy capacity. On the other hand, we have Cynthia. Cynthia is 24. She's a local woman in the community. She is fully literate and numerate. But she doesn't really use her literacy and numeracy skills in her job of washing clothes and selling bread. So what Learning Links is seeing this dynamic between Mary and Cynthia is an opportunity. Can Cynthia actually serve as a tutor to help Mary learn? So Learning Links is seizing this opportunity with a gig economy business model. We're familiar with gig economy business models here in the U.S., but they're also pervasive in emerging markets. And what we're using the model to do is tap into the literacy and numeracy capacity of Cynthia and many more Cynthias to be able to provide education services to Mary and many more Marys. And here is how it works. So number one at the top, we recruit literate and numerate women in local communities in and around Banga in Bong County in Liberia. And we connect these women with out-of-school girls who aren't going to school. And they form small learning groups of about 4 to 5 people that meet 3 times a week and progress through Liberia's alternative basic education curriculum. Now, every day after the girls and the teachers or the tutors meet, Learning Links sends an SMS-based quiz to the girls based on the material that they covered in class that day. And if the girls answer the questions correctly, Learning Links makes a small payment into an education savings account for the girls, and then a small payment into an account for the tutor mentors, which they can redeem for cash. And what this does, it enables these literate and numerate women in rural Liberia to generate a modest income for themselves, supplemental income for themselves and their family by leveraging their literacy and numeracy skills, while at the same time providing much needed education services in their local communities. So does this work? Well, we've been implementing for about a year and have 8 months of data. And the results from the SMS-based quizzes, the girls are getting about 80 or 70% of the questions right from day to day. So 70% they're getting them right. Then we also conduct performance on paper-based verification is about 65%. So the girls are learning and they're retaining their information. So we think this is a great idea, and we really want to scale the Learning Links model. Something we need to address is cost. So right now, the marginal cost for an additional learner is about $300 a year per learner, which is not really competitive with the national education system, which is about $83 per year per student. But we have steps that we're taking in 2019 to take the cost from about $300 per student per year down to about $100 per student per year. And if we're successful, we're really going to unlock the full potential for Learning Links, not just in Liberia, but potentially worldwide. We are currently supporting 300 girls in the pilot stage of this project, and then by the end of 2019, we'll be up to 2,500. But what the really most exciting potential is for Learning Links worldwide is that even in areas across the world where there's low literacy, there are still many, many, many literate and numerate women. There might not be many in many places, but there are some. And Learning Links has the potential to capture their human capacity to provide education services to underserved children. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hard to be five feet tall. My name is Rosemary Garcia. I work for Creative Associates. I'm currently the director for the TVET Say project. I was the chief of party of the project until not too long ago. The TVET Say project is technical vocational education in Nicaragua, which is the second poorest country in the hemisphere. We had development challenges, as you could imagine, in terms of access to education and technological barriers. In terms of internet access, only 24% of the population has access to the internet. Of those people that have access, it's mostly concentrated in the Pacific Coast, where the concentration of the population is. So you can see there's a great deal of challenges in terms of technology availability as a means to education. So of those people that have access to the internet, 80% of them only use it for social media. 80%. Only 11% of the people who use the internet use it for anything educational at all. That's a technological divide. That's a gap that needs to be broken. And we in the project work very, very, very closely with the Caribbean coast, trying to bring technology. We had hackathons. We brought robotics to the youth in the Caribbean coast where there's less internet availability, less technology availability. And we're very excited about the work that I did when we were there. But unfortunately, the situation changed drastically in April. In April, when the youth revolted and started protesting violently against the government, we were faced with a different reality until now. You know, the economy is being devastated, and I don't think there's any end in sight in the near future. There's human rights violations. There's hundreds of deaths, most of them youth. There's illegal arrests. This is the reality of Nicaragua today, which wasn't a reality in January. We were working on a regular development context before, but now we need to adjust. We need to adjust to the fact that there's torture, that there's no freedom of mobility for youth, that they could be stopped anywhere and arrested for having a picture of a protest in their phone. All their contacts could be downloaded, and then they could identify who else they will arrest and who else they will disappear. So this is really, really shocking. And we in TVETSA had to adapt to this reality and figure out what are we going to do? How are we going to continue working in this environment? Well, we decided to really leverage a great deal of the partnerships that we had developed under so-called peacetime. We basically looked at the private sector as a source of inspiration for partnerships and also the TVET centers. And we decided to use online platforms as capacity building solutions, which we had not adopted before. So what do we have now? We have basically a blended program for our scholarships program. The scholarships program is only one component of a project, but yet we need to access those youth that they can't move anymore, and the best way to do it is through technology. There's a platform that was made in Mexico that is called Capacítate para el Empleo, which is built by the Carlos Slim Foundation, and they have 220 courses available, careers available. But nobody was using it because the youth need handholding in this process. They need counselors, they need guidance, they need to be able to break that digital divide that they're under. So we bring them in. Our scholarships are now blended. They're now with the private sector who gives internships. We give them counseling, and we use this platform that is free. So we're really making progress in adapting to this crisis situation. We're also working with the Toyota dealership, Grupo Pelas, and the Kia dealership. They're teaching us higher level of technical vocational education that we can provide online. So this is our lesson. Partnerships, developing win-win strategies, bring everybody on board, and be a link so that way youth can benefit. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eliza Chard, and I'm a manager of technical services at Making Sense International. Now, we often talk about the youth cohort being diverse, and when this comes up, are you ever thinking, well, yeah, of course they're diverse. The youth cohort is made up of 1.8 billion people. What group of 1.8 billion people isn't diverse? Well, digging a little bit deeper, there are a lot of aspects to a young person's identity, and all of them are going to impact the way that they experience a program. But how are we as practitioners actually managing to this diversity in our implementation? Well, at Making Sense,
we've found that a really effective tool for engaging a diverse group of young people is using an inclusion approach. And I'm going to tell you more about what that looks like by telling you about our work on the EF project. So EF, the East Africa Youth Inclusion Program, is a MasterCard Foundation funded project that works in Uganda and Tanzania and engages 25,000 young people in agribusiness. EF works with youth like Josephine, a 16-year-old mother who's working to take care of herself and her daughter, and Isaac, a 23-year-old boda driver who recently inherited a bunch of land, and Nixon, a 15-year-old boy from a poor family who takes care of livestock in exchange for room and board, and Monica, a 22-year-old disabled woman with a knack for bookkeeping. So as you can see, this is a really diverse group of young people, and they have a wide range of needs. And we built elements into our training design and curriculum that spoke directly to that complexity. But we also knew that the community facilitators who actually go out and train these young people would play an integral role in whether they succeeded or failed. And we knew that they would need more support in order to manage this level of diversity. So as a result, we developed a 5-step capacity building process to transform these community facilitators into champions for inclusion at the ground level. So the first step in our process is to make inclusion visible, because one of the challenges of inclusion work is that we're all part of the system that creates these issues in the first place, and as a result, they can be hard to see. So what we do is bring our community facilitators through an inclusion simulation that visually illustrates how young people of different backgrounds will have varied success in the program if no accommodations are made. Next, we create collective buy-in because we need everyone on board if we're going to move the needle. After that, we provide practical, context-specific strategies for how to manage inclusion challenges on the ground. And then we're pretty sneaky because we embed inclusion challenges into every single one of our training activities so that the community facilitators can actually practice identifying and addressing inclusion issues in real time. And then we bring their supervisors through the same training so that they can provide ongoing support in the field. And because we know that inclusion has to be woven into the fabric of a project if we're going to have an impact. So did we have an impact? Well, one of our community facilitators told us, being honest, I realized that I wasn't able to recognize these issues before. Now I'm very sure that no inclusion challenge will go unidentified. And if I can identify it, I'm confident that I can solve it. But were they able to solve them? Well, that's what we wanted to know when we went out for our monitoring trip in May. And what we found was that the answer was overwhelmingly yes. Community facilitators told us about going on voluntary home visits to check up on members who had given birth and adapting their facilitation techniques in order to accommodate illiterate youth, and resetting DSLA share values after realizing they were too high and barring ethnic minorities from being able to save, and negotiating with conservative parents until they allowed their daughters to join the program, and so much more. So the 1.8 billion young people in the world are diverse, and we as practitioners have to learn how to program to that. At Making Sense, inclusion has become a powerful tool in our toolkit, and we hope that it becomes one in yours as well. Thank you.
Sorry, that's what you would hear if there was audio on this slide. I represent a surf therapy program called Waves for Change. My name is Nat McCulloch. And you'd have a bunch of coaches and participants lined up on the beach, and they'd be cheering for positive reinforcement for this mentor and participant who just caught this nice little wave. So we're more than just surfing. Hopefully that's obvious. We provide a caring adult mentor. I believe they're youth as far as we describe them. They tend to be about 18 to 20 years old. We provide a curriculum that teaches children how to recognize their emotions and coping mechanisms to deal with them. They also go out into the community to try to destigmatize mental health challenges. We give them a safe place after school to go and practice these activities, and we give them the challenging activity of surfing. It has worked. We've run a number of RCTs, some third-party evaluations, and we ask teachers, parents, and coaches, and the participants as well, what sort of changes they see. We've seen reductions in gang inclusion from the local police. Teachers have said behavior has improved. We actually train the teachers to identify kids who might be suffering from PTSD, and they tend to have behavior challenges, and they say they improve over time. The kids also say they feel more self-efficacy and confidence. So like everyone else, we started very small. What you see here is Apish, one of our first coaches and founders, blocking the container of surfboards. You see one female on the far right side of this picture. We're doing a roundtable on how we've improved our gender sensitization, so please join us for that. And then you see a bunch of young boys eager to get involved here. We started in the back of this pickup truck. We've since grown to about 5 towns in South Africa. We're also in Liberia and Somalia. We employ about 60 local coaches who are not in education. They've never had a job before and probably wouldn't get one otherwise, but they have a strong affinity for working with local youth, reaching about 1,500 kids, but it's been a very slow growth. Every time we add a new program, we need boards, containers, they have to become part of our HR policies, we have to figure out how to pay them. So we're doing something called starter packs. I've heard El Salvador, Senegal, Nicaragua today, all places with amazing surfing and current or post-conflict. We have some funding. It's much cheaper for us. This is actually how we started Liberia and Somalia. This picture is actually Mogadishu. We start with a few lessons that don't require surfboards, like trust, where they walk into the water together, or pairs floating. If those work and surf therapy works, we send them a bunch of boards and our tools for tracking. If that works, we bring them to Cape Town to see a fully developed surf therapy program and try to help them find their own funding over time. So this is sort of, Danielle mentioned earlier, letting go of the bicycle a bit. Please let us know if you know any candidates. This could just be you know a program near a site that has surf, or you see a local surf hostel. We're happy to take it from there. This is Michaela. She was kicked out of her home, with the white hair, for being gay. She's been one of our most amazing coaches. As part of our scaling up program, we had trouble with paper registers. We wouldn't know till the end of the week that the coaches weren't even taking attendance or if the attendance was bad. So like the 80% of people that only use their mobile phones for social media, we just had the coaches take a selfie with the kids, and then they ticked off the number of kids there. She asked us if she could use that app for her own skateboarding program. I said if she did, I would write a report for her and help her find funding. That started to grow. Another one of our coaches wanted to go back to the Eastern Cape, which is rural. There's no surfing or ocean there. And he wanted to start a girls' soccer program. So now we're starting to pay coaches directly through this app. If you know mentors that have a cell phone and want to try something like this, we're starting a fund to get them paid directly. It tells you where they did it, how long it ran, and how many kids with time, date, location stamps. Nothing magical. Oh, and it works on horrible phones that are offline most of the time. So that's it for our roundtable. We'll be talking about our gender sensitization program. Hopefully you saw there were very few females involved in the early pictures and more as we went on. If you know of local programs that want to add surf therapy, let us know. And if you know anyone wants to use the app, it's free, and we'd love to continue piloting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I hope you brought a lot of business cards. I can see a lot of people who are eager to take your card and implement your surf program, or perhaps attend one of your surf programs. Let's thank again all our lightning talk speakers. I think they did an amazing job. I know it's impossible to pack the wisdom and insights of multi-year programs or the complexity of many of these projects into a 5-minute speech. But I hope that these presentations will entice you to reach out to some of these organizations, some of these projects, and talk to these speakers or include them in your programs in the future. I also know that it's really tough to sit through 50 presentations after lunch, so I just have a very quick activity, and I know I only have like half a minute. So just quickly, those of you who like cats, please stand up. Cats, C-A-T-S. All right, you can sit down again. Everybody who likes dogs, please stand up. Oh, wow. Okay, I think I hear some hissing and growling somewhere around here. You can sit down again. Now, if you have heard about positive youth development, please stand up. I hope that gets everybody out of their chair. All right, you can sit down again. And now, if you've read the Positive Youth Development Toolkit or have used any positive youth development measurements ever, please stand up. Great, great. We like that. And then one last thing, if you think that positive youth development should be included in every youth program, please stand up and go, woohoo! All right. Now back to the serious work. So after we have listened to a lot of new and innovative ideas today, and over the last year, I think you all have heard a lot about what we know in positive youth development. It's also important to know what we don't know. And so the next session will take us through the new learning agenda that will address some of those questions. And the learning agenda was developed by YouthPower Learning in cooperation with so many of you here in the room. Cassandra Jesse, our project director, will lead us through this session. She has over 20 years of experience in M&E and project management and experience in Africa and long resume. So she has also led co-led the systematic review for positive youth development, and that's been at the basis of this new learning agenda. So Cassandra?
Great, thank you everyone. And I'll have even my fellow panelists to just come up and join me. Although we're going to start with a bit of a presentation, and I'll introduce the learning agenda. Then we'll have some discussion with some colleagues. We'll get to have some time to have an activity, and we'll end with sort of a quick wrap-up of next steps. So I'll let you guys come on up for a moment, just so we can transition quickly during the process. So we're kind of doing a 4-in-1 during this session, so we'll keep you alive. And I'm excited because we've had a couple announcements today, but to me, one of our big announcements really is around the launch of this learning agenda for positive youth development, and it's focused on low and middle income countries. And this learning agenda aims to advance the field of positive youth development with a particular focus in low and middle income countries. It builds on the work that we have done to understand what we know about PYD and its applications, and it pushes us forward to understand what works, where, and for whom. So the learning agenda is a global one, and while it was developed by my team in YouthPower Learning with the USAID funding, the agenda is bigger than us, and it is meant for all of us that are working with youth in low and middle income countries. And this includes those that are funding, those that are designing programs, implementing programs, and evaluating them. So who here has ever used a learning agenda before? Can you raise your hands? Who's interacted with one? All right, so a good number of you. So few of you will need my definition around what it actually is. But just quick grounding, broad set of questions directly related to the work in our case, the youth development community, when answered will enable us to work more effectively and efficiently, especially when we're thinking on the evaluation, evidence, and decision-making side of our work. So in this learning agenda, We provide guidance on how to address evidence gaps with both guiding questions and ideas about how you can contribute to this agenda. And finally, sort of true to our network, we are creating spaces for sharing resources and knowledge, as well as fostering opportunities for collaboration around the learning agenda. I think some of you may have seen this graphic before from the USAID Learning Lab outlining the typical journey for a learning agenda, and we did undertake a similar one. But I would say our work started in number 2, where we were curating the existing research. We set out, and we were tasked to understand about what works in PYD. But that said, even though we started with number 2, our work began with strongly grounded in step number 1 in the engagement of stakeholders. We worked with a lot of you and a lot of others around the world to determine what's the definition of positive youth development, identify key areas for our research, and in our journey for looking for indicators. So we came up with 2 very big reports. There were a couple copies outside. I think they've all disappeared. But we have the original task, which was to write a systematic review of positive youth development in low and middle income countries and really try to understand what the evidence says about their effectiveness and what works. We used the recommendations outlined in this report as steps for this learning agenda. So they sort of served as the foundation for sort of the key themes and priority areas. While conducting the systematic review, we also developed this PYD measurement toolkit to think about how do we measure PYD and providing guidance on how to design and measure PYD programs. During its development, we recognized gaps in positive youth development measurement, and I am excited that so many of you stood up to say you are either measuring PYD or you've been using this toolkit, because it is a key resource for us in being able to answer the questions outlined in the learning agenda. So once we launched these resources, we recognized there was a need to prioritize the next steps. We went back to that step 1 and really ground truth the key PYD areas and themes, as we called them, and we moved forward to step 3 to formulate and prioritize questions. And this really was an iterative process going back and forth and using step number 2 in the middle as a grounding point for us. We conducted consultations with key leaders in positive youth development. We gathered additional input from stakeholders like yourself. At this meeting last year, we gathered input from youth stakeholders. We discussed with the Global Youth Economic Opportunity Summit participants. We reached out during the American Evaluation Association to the IAAH, and we used opportunities where there were youth advocates together to talk through what are the different themes, where do you see priorities, what are the types of questions that would advance our work. So then in conjunction with key leaders and with USAID's Youth Corps, we drafted an initial set of questions. We received some important input through surveys with USAID missions and the YouthPower communities of practice. And we even held a day-long consultation with many of you here in this room to prioritize these questions. So part of what I want to say is a lot of you were involved, and it was a really critical part to getting to where we are today. And this discussion is really to help us figure out how do we move forward as a field and thinking about our own ways to contribute to this learning agenda. So we've developed 5 themes. These themes are understanding how PYD programs achieve positive impact in low and middle income countries, and this is really focused on the how. We had called it mechanisms at one point, and that didn't go over well, but we are getting at how we do this. Thinking about the cross-sectoral impact of PYD programs, not just single sector focus, but recognizing it cuts across. The measurement of PYD constructs and knowing we need to focus around the measurement of PYD, not just the sectoral outcomes that we often focus on in our programs. Thinking about PYD for vulnerable and marginalized populations, and then youth engagement in PYD programs. Under each of these themes, we've developed 2 questions and several illustrative sub-questions. We've intentionally left them broad. You're not going to see very specific sectors against these, although we believe that there is a sectoral overlay that could happen to make sure that this is a lens that feeds back into your your verticals or your silos as sometimes we might experience them, but recognize that the sectors are in here. So I'm going to quickly run through each of these themes so you just have a better sense of what these actually mean. So the first one, understanding how PYD programs achieve their impact. It is the how. One of the things that we saw in the systematic review is that programs didn't self-identify as PYD, and they didn't consistently measure those PYD outcomes. So many of you have heard me say, use the expression, call a spade and call the PYD program a PYD program. I am thrilled that so many of the lightning talks reference PYD. So many of you in your discussions have actually used that terminology. That alone is going to help us continue to be able to gather the evidence in this space. Although PYD programs have been implemented and tested in low and middle income countries, few studies included measures or evaluations about how the effects were achieved. And it's really important to determine, did they achieve these results through the PYD mechanisms by increasing skills, by improving those assets, by amplifying and empowering young people and leveraging their agency through their contribution? What changes in the enabling environment? Basically, trying to get to that how question. Research on successful programs achieve their goals, understanding how they achieve their goals, can help us as program developers understand the complex set of PYD program targets that have been demonstrated to be effective in similar environments and how we can translate them into different environments. So thinking about the conflict versus non-conflict. And so the two questions that we have is sort of the two overarching ones. Do PYD programs in low and middle income countries achieve their longer term or sectoral outcomes by affecting PYD outcomes? So some of the sub-questions that we've outlined include, do PYD programs impact their intended PYD outcomes? Are changes in PYD outcomes linked to improved longer-term sectoral outcomes for program beneficiaries? Second question is, can PYD programs be proven to be effective? Can they be adapted to different contexts? Are there examples of successful adaptation of evidence-based programs? Are there systematic ways of adapting the evidence to different contexts or situations or audiences? And what are the most cost-effective ways, and that's an important one, to adapt programs to specific conditions in different low and middle income countries? Our second theme, the cross-sectoral impacts of PYD programs, really comes from how evaluations in the systematic review were largely not rigorously evaluated. Only 18% of them were what we would call high-quality, rigorous impact evaluations. And they were usually only in one sector, and it really did limit the knowledge that we have about PYD's effectiveness in other sectors. Less was known about the short and long-term effects of PYD programming due to the lack of that rigorous studies. And most evaluations focused on a very much of a single sector-specific outcome, HIV, sexual reproductive health, workforce, rather than looking across multiple sectors. And PYD is a holistic approach, and it has the potential to have a positive impact on a broad range of outcomes and with benefits that can last a lifetime. However, more research really is needed to understand those short and long-term effects of PYD on multiple outcomes in low and middle income countries. So our first question is really around, do PYD programs have a significant positive effect on outcomes in positive sectors? We sort of resoundingly feel like that answer is yes, and we have a lot of evidence that point in that direction. It's more limited than we wish. So what are the barriers and opportunities to achieving cross-sectoral outcomes? How can we apply lessons learned in one sector to another sector? And can PYD strategies reduce costs and increase benefits by having an impact on outcomes across multiple sectors? And then thinking of the second question, what are the best ways to design and implement a PYD program with cross-sectoral outcomes in low and middle income countries? Do programs with more PYD features have an impact across more sectors? We don't know. Do PYD programs which build general life skills have an impact across more sectors than programs that are focused primarily on very specific skills, like you're using a condom or job training. So that's that second theme. Our third theme is really important in thinking about the measurement of PYD constructs. And one of the things that we saw in the systematic review is that most programs did not use validated tools of PYD constructs as indicators of their program impacts. And it really is important to measure this because it's the intermediary linkage between the sector-specific outcomes and our understanding about how it could apply in different sectors. Using valid and reliable tools of PYD constructs will provide essential data on how PYD approaches work to impact outcomes in low and middle income countries. Most existing tools assess constructs at the individual level, and we really need to be developing tools that are both valid and reliable measures that capture changes in policy, practices, impacts, and that indicate that youth are in a more enabling environment and that the agencies and systems and other organizations have greater capacity to provide PYD programs. So the two key questions outlined here are, one, processes or strategies are critical adaptation of reliable and valid PYD tools in different contexts. How do we determine whether or not a measure found to be reliable in one context is actually appropriate for another context? What are the costs and benefits of adapting a tool versus developing a new tool for the new context? And the second question, how do we best measure the implementation of PYD approaches at the program, system, or agency level? What measures exist to evaluate the extent to which a program is PYD or not? Can we evaluate the impact of efforts to increase the capacity of a system or agency to implement PYD programs or policies? PYD for for vulnerable or marginalized populations is our fourth theme. The systematic review found a major gap in programming focused on vulnerable and marginalized populations. We saw very little that was actually focused or targeted to the LGBTI, to youth who inject drugs, to the many marginalized hats that potentially people are wearing. So can PYD programs be designed to be applicable to all youth, also known as universal programs, or do they need to be tailored so that they're applicable to particular subgroups? And more evidence is really needed about whether universal or tailored programs are more appropriate, and in what context is that more appropriate. So the key questions, what are the barriers or facilitators for including vulnerable and marginalized populations in universal and PYD programs? So how effective are these for serving these different populations? And then the second one is really around the tailoring of programs. How effective are tailored PYD programs at serving the needs of vulnerable or marginalized populations? Our fifth theme, and our final one, is youth engagement in PYD programs. About half of the programs identified in the systematic review explicitly targeted youth engagement or leadership as an outcome. We know anecdotally we believe in youth engagement, but we just have less evidence that it works, and for how and in what ways and what kind of impact does it have. So we have two key questions here. One is around what strategies are effective in enabling meaningful youth engagement. So how do we distinguish from leadership, from participation? What are effective strategies for preparing adults to share power with young people? Thinking about building up leadership through developmental phases, and so multiple sub-questions. And then what are the best ways to measure and evaluate the impact of various levels of youth engagement on intended PYD indicators and program outcomes? Are programs with high levels of youth engagement or specific types of youth engagement more effective than others? And do youth who engage in PYD programs in depth or in specific ways get more benefit from the programs? And there's a few other questions. So this learning agenda was designed to be a first of many steps towards better understanding when and how PYD programs work. We acknowledge there are different questions that could be asked and that could be addressed. But this learning agenda is just one effort to collectively guide our work over the next 3 or so years. So you will find in your folders a long document with the full agenda, and on your tables you'll find a short handout to be able to read a bit more. In this very long handout, we offer examples about how you as the youth development stakeholders can contribute to answering questions in the learning agenda. And recognizing that you can choose to engage at various points in the program or project life cycle, we have examples organized by different categories, whether you're in the design phase or data collection phase or thinking about analysis or how you're going to amplify your work. I do want to emphasize that to take these learnings to scale or to have a larger impact, we need to be working with youth and their communities across contexts to determine what works for them and for whom. This is an unfunded learning agenda in that we as the developers are not specifically tasked to doing the research and answer these questions. Rather, our role is to be the curator and amplifier of learning that comes from the broader youth development community. And that means you in this room. So we get to harness the great work that you guys are doing and be able to make it become a focus and a learning that we can all build from. So it's our hope that you as the community of practitioners, researchers, and funders interested in PYD will take a role in bringing this agenda to life, contributing your findings to help answer these important questions. And ultimately, this learning can lead to an evidence-based program that provides meaningful improvements in the lives of the young people we support. So with that, and to get us thinking about the ways that we can contribute, I'd like to ask my colleague Jacinta Kapungu, who is the Senior Gender and Youth Specialist on our project and from the International Center for Research on Women, as one of the key contributors in the development of this learning agenda. And she's going to moderate a discussion with three people, a researcher, an implementer, and a funder that we collectively believe represent each of you in this room. Jacinta, it's all you.
Hello, everyone. Our next panel will talk about how their work can contribute to the learning agenda. So first, I'm going to start with Rebecca. As Director of Research at the Institute of Reproductive Health at Georgetown University, you've implemented reproductive health interventions that improve youth well-being using a positive youth development approach and focus closely on measuring and evaluating interventions. Can you talk a little bit about this work and how it can contribute to the learning agenda?
Thanks, Christina. So I have to label myself as one of those PYD deniers. For years I've been saying, no, I do adolescent programs, I do social norms programming, and Christina has, for maybe 4 years at least, been convincing me that that is not the case. So this was a great opportunity, and I really appreciate being asked to be on this panel, because it gave me the opportunity to think back about our work. So today I'm really reflecting on the work that we're conducting with our partners on the Passages Project, which is a USAID-funded project implemented in partnership with FHI 360, PSI, Save the Children, the Global Adolescent Study, Early Adolescent Study at Johns Hopkins. So I was kind of thinking back about our different interventions. We have some work around gender, we have work around family planning, around violence prevention, with different age groups, so younger adolescents, older adolescents, and newly married adolescents. And I think, I'm kind of thinking back through asset-based, building agency, contribution, and the enabling environment. And yes, I think all of our work does definitely check off all those boxes. So then that made me think about why don't we see ourselves as generating evidence for positive youth development? Since we are a research project and that's our task, why don't we see that? And I think it's very similar to some of the struggles we've had with gender. So gender is embedded in our work, has been, of course, for many years, but there's not a lot of research until recently which is explicitly looking at the outcomes of gender. And an example that occurred to me is our work in DRC with the Transforming Masculinities Project, which is working with faith-based organizations to foster reflection, to address gender, promote positive masculinities, reduce intimate partner violence, and increase family planning use. So, but our research question on that is not faith-based, working with faith-based partners and family planning use. It's, does changing gender norms influence family planning uptake? So we really struggled a lot back and forth with USAID and our partners to craft a hypothesis and a research question that pulled out the unique effect of gender. So I kind of think of that as an analogy for the work we need to do with positive youth development. So, we could use similar research like that, where we're pulling out the positive youth development piece of it to see what the effect is, what the advantages of it. But there's a number of problems with that. So we need a counterfactual, we need a control group. So none of the partners I work would probably be willing to implement, even in a control group, an intervention that doesn't apply positive youth development. So that's the first problem. How do we even design research like that? I mean, it is possible. And the second is that there's not a lot of funding to do that. So that presents some challenges. So what's the solution? How can us and our IRH and our partners and all of you kind of tackle this learning agenda given those barriers? The design challenges of pulling out positive youth development as well as the funding challenges and the fact that this may not be all of our daily bread and butter, right? It's something we're doing, but we're not necessarily responsible for measuring it. So I have a couple of ideas. So one is working on the measurement side. So the extent which Cassandra already alluded to, the extent to which we can develop and test, accessible, validated measures to measure and evaluate the PYD constructs, then we can all do better, I think. Because as we do that, we will be able to generate evidence, pieces of evidence, and we'll be able, as researchers, to help the programs use that evidence. So that's one piece. We're working on some areas, for example, a self-efficacy scale for partner communication and negotiation, a scale for critical reflection, something on body satisfaction, body comfort, empowerment for early adolescents. So all those are constructs that I think many of us can use in teasing out some of that PYD piece. The other area that I think is really important is work we're doing on social norms. So to get to that enabling environment, we need to have adequate, good measures on social norms. So working with many of you in our learning collaborative funded by the Gates Foundation, we're working to put online, probably by the end of this year, a compendium of tested social norms measures. We've found about 60 tools that measure different kinds of social norms, and that will be available for all of us to use. And then the other area, which is I think even more important, is really starting to work on those program pathways. So we're doing some work with a number of partners in Senegal, DRC, Nigeria, to unpack that black box of programming. So we need to kind of look into that box and figure out how are the PYD principles being actualized? How are they rolling out? What effect are they having? And that really is not going to be done by a clinical trial and RCT. That's going to be done by some very strong partnerships between researchers and implementers on the ground to look at the monitoring data, to look at qualitative data, to do some participatory work with beneficiaries and implementers to start to map out those program pathways of change and see how it evolves over time. I mean, sometimes that's really, I don't know if I would use the word mechanisms, but it's the how. How do these programs work? And that work will help us do a few things. It will help us identify opportunities for research. We've some work with the Husband School in Niger. We figured out they're missing evidence on one piece of this. So let's help them develop that evidence. So we can we can identify opportunities for targeted research. We can build evidence, and we can also kind of get the information we need to guide adaptation and scale up to test these interventions in new contexts to see if they can hold true to those pieces that are transformative.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I think you make some good points about first you have to identify that it is a PYD program, and we've gotten that from the various countries that we've been to, and then determine what those components are. Kristen, as a program implementer and as project director for YouthPower Action and director of the Youth and Learning Practice at FHI 360, your work has focused on implementation of youth-focused programs. Tell us a little about this work and what elements you see more salient into contributing to the learning agenda.
Thank you, Trisina. When I was first asked to be in this panel, it took me a moment to realize we're really already on this path to the PYD learning agenda. We've actually done a lot of things that are contributing to this agenda. One of the very first things we did in YouthPower Action was to work with YouthPower Learning and to come up with a PYD framework. So when we were developing PYD training program for USID, we needed to come up with what is our framework, what are we talking about, which is how we got to domains and features. The next things we did was try to help look at the whole area of soft skills and that critical category of assets to first identify which skills are most important to which outcomes. So we've got skills to outcomes. Then out of that, we wanted to look at, are there certain skills that are common across youth programs? And so we identified 3 skill sets that are important across different youth cross-sectoral outcomes, so we can create greater consistency of the skills that we're targeting. Then we started looking at, so how do we measure those skills? So we did a review of existing soft skills measurement instruments. We created an inventory, just as the one mentioned earlier, that gives us all access to tools, to instruments that measure soft skills, with enough information about what are the outcomes they're linked to, so the community has access to those instruments. But more than that, we wanted to develop an instrument that will help us measure those key priority cross-sector youth soft skills. And we have developed an instrument that addressed many of the challenges that we found in our research, and we're currently piloting a tool that measures those key priority soft skills, cross-sectoral soft skills, that we're piloting in Guatemala and in Uganda. And later this year we'll be able to share that tool. And our hope is that that tool can be used across programs. The instrument measures change over time. So we would have a validated PYD measurement tool that can create consistency of use across context and youth segments. The next things we did on the question relating to the impact of cross-sectoral programs is we carried out research. We wanted to look at integrated programs, so we did an assessment of programs that integrated sexual and reproductive health and workforce development. And one of the great things that we found, we looked at effective programs, so that one of the common features were PYD features. And out of that, we created a theory of change around what made for effective integrated SRH and workforce programs. And now we're going to go one step further and to compare, do programs that have that theory of change with those PYD elements that are integrated, how do they compare against a single sector workforce development program? So we're carrying out an impact evaluation of a program that Save the Children is implementing in Bangladesh, and we do both an impact evaluation and a process evaluation, which will help us get at those key questions. How is this change happening? Which program elements are impacting youth, and how do youth experience them differently? And we're also looking at kind of the cost analysis. What are these different, the integrated program costs compared to the regular program? So that's what we've been doing under YouthPower Action. Under our work under strengthening civil society, we're developing a tool that will be a youth programming self-assessment tool to help youth-serving organizations understand how well they're implementing positive youth development, and we're building on that PYD framework. So the tool provides indicators and a rubric to help organizations to think about how well they do youth engagement, for example. So if we were doing a program working with a number of different youth-serving organizations, we could look at, do organizations that are doing higher levels of youth engagement, do they have better youth engagement outcomes? And so that will help us get at that question under Theme 5 around youth engagement. I want to talk a little bit about why this learning agenda is so important. And us on the implementation side use the evidence as we design programs. We did a program in Uganda to create a girls mentoring program, and we all knew mentoring is an important asset, an important program, a good PYD feature relating to healthy relationships and helping young people access positive adult role models. But we then we did a very evidence-based, we carried out a literature review, we looked at some PYD elements and designed a program, a holistic program, cross-sectoral program, that is now coming up. We found some important outcomes in terms of behavior and change and knowledge, and you can hear more about at one of our roundtables on girls mentoring. And we also found that we used tools. We were doing a large program working with orphan and vulnerable children in Mozambique, and we had to take this large program and within a year's time put a really strong adolescent lens on it. So we took the development assets profile, a validated tool, and said, let's look at how we can take this program and implement things according to those different asset pieces. It really does help inform programming. So I think for those of us on the implementation, on the action side, this is really, really important to our work. This is not just a measurement question. This is really about action.
Thank you, Kirsten. Marianne, As a Civil Society and Media Division Chief in USAID's Center of Excellence on Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, you have a long history of working on youth issues within USAID and previously serving as the agency's interim youth coordinator. The USAID Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Learning Agenda is a set of 12 questions, research questions, in priority development areas for which the DRG Center intends to organize and disseminate existing data, generate new evidence. So you have experience with the learning agenda. So can you tell us a little bit about this work?
Sure. And just to say, to start with, I want to commend Making Sense and YouthPower generally for this work on the learning agenda. And not only that it's a collective effort, because clearly the gorilla in the room is the fact that there's not a lot of money for evaluation, right? And so that's why we all have to work together on this. And I think the DRG, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Learning Agenda experience has some lessons that might be useful with regard to the PYD experience. So the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Center, and the Learning Division in particular, and the broader center has done an incredible amount of work to kind of address the challenges within the DRG, that's our acronym, space in terms of lack of evidence or limited evidence. And that included developing a learning agenda, which had initially the 12 questions that were developed through intensive engagement with the sector. And from that, they then did literature reviews for the different questions to see what existing evidence there was. And if there was limited evidence, they did some synthesizing in some cases of case studies across those questions and tried to answer the questions. And they found that they did develop a fair amount of good evidence in that regard, but that there were a lot of gaps. And a lot of times the literature reviews didn't show patterns emerging, or sometimes there simply wasn't evidence. And so as the learning division in our center started to think about what to do next, they decided to kind of take a more slightly different approach going forward. They'll continue some of the in-depth evidence generation. So for example, looking at multi-site impact evaluations and rolling those up across sites. But they're also wanting to take a focus that was more programmatic and utilization focused. So my colleague, I am not an evaluation expert or anything, but my colleague who's leading this was saying, you know, if you simply can't find something scientific or you have limitations in that space, you might as well ensure that your evidence gathering is actionable, right? And so some of the plans going forward are to, for example, on kind of the programmatic side, to do a programmatic inventory within the democracy, human rights, and governance space to better understand the nature of the programs, what we're really doing out there, and this kind of gets to understanding the PYD elements and PYD programs, and what the gaps are, and kind of starting from that perspective. And so that it's really linked to our actual programs in the field, right? Not just kind of some general brainstorming on some of the challenges. The second thing that they've already started to do with the current or previous learning agenda that is promising and I think is relevant for our discussion here is to use our global programs or mechanisms in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Center to help advance the learning agenda. So for example, we have a human rights support mechanism project that adopted the previous learning agenda questions or the learning agenda questions for the center and started to kind of play with them in the field. So for example, they would use their implementing partners. This is a Leader with Associates Award. And they would hold in-country or regional workshops that would be design workshops. It would be opportunities to bring in people that are working on these human rights programs and say, how does your lived experience relate to these learning agenda questions? So they're really looking at kind of taking every opportunity they could to get feedback from the field on the learning agenda questions, so really adopting that learning agenda. And they're also looking at adding a component to actually generate evidence. And then also within that mechanism, designing, monitoring, and evaluation learning system to systematically collect evidence related to the learning agenda. I'm also the program manager of our Strengthening Civil Society Globally, the Chris Award, a Strengthening Civil Society program that has a similar, array of consortium members. And we're looking at how we can use that mechanism also to advance the learning agenda. And ways to kind of incorporate the questions within that. So I want us to think creatively about the fact that we have YouthPower, but you also have a number of programs that you're involved in and how you might be able to adopt some of these questions, or an array of them, and embed them in your work. And just some kind of closing thoughts in terms of lessons learned from the DRG learning agenda. I mean, one really is entities such as Making Sense and YouthPower Learning that are in the space to identify processes to roll up the different experiences that we have, right? So it's like, what are the processes that we can put in place to pull learning around these questions, right? So that's a challenge, but that's an opportunity. Again, how can you use your existing programs, mechanisms, to advance this learning agenda? You're probably sitting there thinking about, well, it's not just us, USAID needs to be on board with this too. The fact that we are very much involved in helping to develop the learning agenda is great, right? And we're still trying to socialize this and PYD throughout the agency. We have a number of trainings with field officers that are very positive, and so that provides an opportunity to work with field officers to say, yes, this is a space for us to come together and to generate learning. And then really to keep in mind that academics, to really tap into the academic community, right, and to say that they oftentimes will engage with you as practitioners for non-monetary reasons, right, for advancing their research. So really to explore ways to link your projects on the ground with academics, and they can also provide linkages to graduate assistance. So again, not to get overwhelmed, use existing programs, explore creative means to engage with the academic community and the communities of practice that are part of YouthPower Learning.
Thank you. And it's all, as our panelists have talked about, it's evidence gathering for action. So we talked about, you ended about the communities of practice, and YouthPower has 4 of them. And so how can the communities of practice also contribute to the learning agenda? Now, Rebecca, IRH has been involved in a number of community practices. Do you have any thoughts on how this work would help advance the PYD learning agenda?
I do, actually. I think, I don't know if the rest of you are like me, you're probably in a number of communities of practice with different foci, and I think it's a really great opportunity to bring positive youth development and put it on the table. So I'm thinking of like the service communication community of practice, or Breakthrough Research has technical advisory networks, that maybe kind of thinking of a different topic, but positive youth development is definitely relevant. So I think it's an opportunity to foster collaboration between researchers, donors, and also, most importantly, the program implementers who have a sense of, they bring a lot of knowledge and ideas to the table, and by working together, we can help to identify opportunities for research, opportunities where monitoring data and evaluation data can be synthesized and shared more widely to really promote knowledge generation and sharing. So I think it's like incumbent on each of us maybe to think about, as we are participating in our different communities of practice, keeping YouthPower, positive youth development present in our, kind of on our agenda, and getting it out there on the table for discussion.
And YouthPower Learning will be collating that evidence that you're already doing within your own work. Kristen, what challenges do you see for adapting your work to align with the learning agenda? I've been involved in learning agendas. There's always that challenge. And what ideas do you have to overcome those challenges?
One challenge I was speaking earlier about, hey, we're going to have this soft school instrument, and you can, take it and measure your programs across context, but we know that you really have to adapt an instrument and make sure that really can translate into a different context, a different age segment, a different culture. So one of the ways that we've been doing that is doing qualitative cognitive testing before we use an instrument, and that's a good way to address some of those things and make sure that these terms and these concepts really do translate across populations. To do that takes time and takes resources. The other challenge I wanted to talk about is I brought along Mike McKibbe's favorite rubric, because one of the challenges that we have in terms of the theme number 1 about how does PYD really affect change is thinking about the complexity. We have domains, we have features, we have programs that we implement across ecosystems. So how can you, as hard as it is to get this rubric to work, how do you help isolate and understand the interaction between those features and those different levels of the ecosystem? And what do we really call a PYD program? How do we know when something is enough of these different elements across ecosystems and enabling environments to say this is a PYD program? So I think that's something we as a community can help contribute to that based on our experiences. And I think that is going to take a collective work to help us think that through.
Thank you. The activities within YouthPower all started with the USAID's Youth and Development Policy Goals. That's where it started. And so, Marianne, I wanted to talk with you about how does the PYD learning agenda align or support the policy?
Great, thanks. I see it as absolutely directly linked to the policy goal and objectives. So as I mentioned, a number of USAID colleagues were involved in providing feedback on the learning agenda. A lot of those questions are questions that come up in our positive youth development training. People ask these questions. You see them, right? Well, who cares? What's the impact of cross-sectoral programs, right? That's people want evidence. So I think it's directly linked to the positive youth development policy. For those of you who aren't don't have it memorized, the objectives of the policy, were to strengthen our youth programming and participation, so really strengthen our youth programs and help us mainstream youth throughout our development work, right? And so a lot of the questions that you saw that Cassandra went through are absolutely relevant for that. Also, I think it was referenced probably earlier in the morning, we've recently done, and AIYD has also done an assessment of the implementation of the policy, and the issue of monitoring and evaluation was raised as an area that needs more work. So clearly, to continue to make the case, people want to see the results, that people need and want more evidence. So that's given. And I think, again, just a number of the questions I think are absolutely relevant to USAID's work, to the assessment of the policy questions that came up in that assessment in terms of youth engagement. That was one of the gap areas as well, that we're not doing enough of that. How do we do that better? The trainings that we do, we talk about the positive youth development features, but the real interesting questions are really how, which features, as Kristen was mentioning. I mean, there's so many critical questions that are highlighted there in the learning agenda, and then again, it's going to require our broader community to adopt it, right? And so not just USAID, also but other funders. I know that Mike McCabe and others have been working with other donors, and they were part of, interviewed as well for this. So we really have to own that, and basically try to advance this effort together. So again, it's socializing it across the board, and continue. And I think the other point I wanted to make is that the framework that's provided in the learning agenda, I think, is also very practical and useful. So take a look at that, and it gives concrete ideas of ways in which you can kind of analyze, collect information, et cetera, for this.
This has been definitely a journey and a group effort, and I want to thank our panelists, Marianne, Rebecca, and Kristen. Now, Cassandra's going to kick us off on some group activities so we can reflect on how we as a community can contribute to the learning agenda.
All right, thank you. Marianne, Rebecca, Kristen, Jacinta, thank you so much for sharing how you see this learning agenda shaping your work and giving us some ideas about how we can contribute to it. So we would like each of you to reflect where you see yourself in this learning agenda, and we want you to answer two questions. Where are you working, what are you working on that will help you respond to this learning agenda and advance the PYD field? And this is really refer to something you're doing currently, something that you see coming up in the future, something you could adapt that you are that you see that's either in progress or anticipated. And then how will the learning agenda help inform your work? And so this is really trying to get some ideas about what are key areas we should focus on to help you program better, research better, and ultimately for us to better support young people. So Jacinta will actually walk you through the logistics of this next exercise, but I want to emphasize that we will use the outcomes of the exercise. We will follow up with opportunities for collaboration and amplification within the themes, that will use your answers on how the learning agenda can inform your work to guide where we focus our curation and synthesis efforts. So these next few minutes are actually important, and we will gather them. So Jacinta?
So we'd like you to work with your neighbor in pairs to take 5 minutes to discuss these two questions about how your work can contribute to the learning agenda. And then as you can see, across the room there are 5 flip charts with the 5 themes that signify the 5 themes. And so as you are writing down your thoughts and your contributions on the sticky pads on your table, we want you to either to get up and put the sticky tabs onto the flip charts. So you want me to discuss with your neighbor how you can contribute to the learning agenda, use the sticky pads to write down those activities, and then get up to put those sticky pads on the themes. So 5 minutes of discussion and writing, and then we can circulate around the room.
And include your name, organization, and email so we can follow up with you.